For most of our time on this planet, the idea of staying put was just impossible. Think about it. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were one. We were nomadic, following the great herds of animals, moving with the changing seasons, and chasing the sources of fresh water. There were no borders, no passports, no permanent homes, and certainly no sprawling cities. Life was a constant journey, a rhythm dictated by the land itself. This nomadic life was tough and uncertain, but it offered one incredible advantage: flexibility. Movement was the ultimate survival strategy. If the food supply in one area ran out, you simply packed up and moved on. If a dangerous predator or a rival group appeared on the horizon, you could leave. The land wasn't something you owned. It was a resource you used temporarily before continuing your journey. This constant motion was the very definition of human existence. Then, around 12,000 years ago, something truly revolutionary happened. A spark of genius that would change our species forever. We figured out we didn't have to chase our food anymore. We could grow it. This is the dawn of agriculture. Humans learned that seeds could be collected, planted in the ground, and nurtured to produce a predictable harvest. And that harvest could be stored for the lean times. For the very first time in our history, survival no longer demanded constant movement. Staying in one place became a real, viable option. This shift from hunting and gathering to farming wasn't just a new way to get dinner. It was a complete paradigm shift that reshaped every aspect of human society. It was the catalyst for civilization as we know it. Temporary camps, once used for a season, slowly evolved into permanent villages. These weren't just collections of shelters, they were communities. People started to specialize. While some farmed, others could become toolmakers, builders, or leaders. Life became more complex, more organized. As villages grew, they became the first towns, and eventually, the first cities. With a stable food supply, populations could expand like never before. And with permanent settlement came a brand new concept: ownership. The land you farmed wasn't just a temporary resource anymore. It was yours. It was valuable. This led to the drawing of boundaries, the creation of property rights, and inevitably, conflicts over who owned what. The world, which was once an open expanse, was now being carved up into territories. This new, settled life also required new forms of organization. We needed rules to live together in close quarters. We needed leaders to manage resources and resolve disputes. This gave rise to social hierarchies, governments, and laws. Monumental structures could be built, like temples and pyramids, because there was now a large, stationary workforce to build them. Writing was developed, not for poetry, but to keep track of grain stores and trade records. The entire architecture of human society was being redesigned from the ground up. So, how exactly did this happen? What were the first crops we domesticated? How did early farmers defend their land and their harvests? What challenges did they face? In this video, we're going to dig deep into the agricultural revolution. We'll explore the ingenuity and the struggles of our ancestors as they made the monumental decision to stop wandering and start building. We'll see how this single choice, the choice to stay, unleashed a chain reaction that created social classes, empires, and the very concept of history itself. Because when our constant movement finally ended, the story of our civilization truly began. The first topic is life on the move. Imagine a world without addresses, without borders, without the very idea of a permanent home. For over 99% of human history, this wasn't imagination, it was reality. This is the story of our ancestors, a story of life on the move. Before the first cities rose, before the first fields were planted, humanity was a river, not a fortress. We were nomads wandaos, living in a world that was constantly shifting, and our survival depended on our ability to shift with it. Our ancient relatives lived in small, tight-knit groups, perhaps no larger than a big family today. Their lives were an endless journey, a dance with the seasons. They followed the great herds of mammoths, bison, and reindeer across vast, untamed landscapes. They knew the secret rhythms of the earth, when and where the wild berries would ripen, which riverbeds would teem with fish, and where to find the precious flint needed to make their tools. Their world wasn't measured in square miles of owned land, but in the cycles of animal migration and the fruiting of plants. Think about what that means. Every day was an exercise in awareness. Your senses were your most valuable possession. The snap of a twig could signal danger or dinner. The direction of the wind could carry the scent of rain or the smell of a predator. You had to be completely present, completely tuned in to the world around you. There was no room for distraction. Your life and the lives of your family depended on it. Their homes were temporary masterpieces of ingenuity, a cave offering shelter from a storm, a simple lean-to made of branches and animal hides, or just a spot by a crackling fire under a canopy of stars. Nothing was built to last, because they themselves were not meant to last in one place. Possessions were a burden. You couldn't own what you couldn't carry. This simple fact shaped their entire society. Hoarding made no sense. Why collect 100 stone axes when you can only carry a few? Why gather more food than your group could eat before it spoiled? This necessity to travel light created a culture of incredible generosity and cooperation. Sharing wasn't just a nice idea, it was a fundamental survival strategy. The successful hunters shared their kill with everyone, knowing that tomorrow they might be the one returning empty-handed, relying on the success of another. Status wasn't determined by wealth, because wealth, as we know it, didn't exist. It was earned through skill, wisdom, and courage. The best hunter, the most knowledgeable healer, or the wisest elder might lead the group for a time, but their leadership was fluid. It was earned, not inherited, and it could shift as the group's needs changed. There were no kings, no permanent chiefs, just people contributing their strengths for the good of all. This nomadic life was a masterclass in adaptability. If a drought dried up a watering hole, they didn't despair. They packed up and moved on. If a rival group entered their hunting grounds, they didn't fight to the death over a patch of dirt. They simply shifted their path. The concept of owning land would have seemed utterly bizarre to them. How can you own the wind? How can you own the river? The land wasn't a resource to be exploited. It was a living partner, a provider, and sometimes a formidable adversary. Of course, this life wasn't a peaceful stroll through an untouched paradise. It was incredibly hard. Danger was a constant companion. A sudden blizzard, a fall from a cliff, an encounter with a cave, but any of these could spell disaster. Starvation was a real and recurring threat. Life was a high-wire act, a delicate balance between finding enough to eat and avoiding being eaten yourself. It was a life of constant effort, of walking mile after mile, day after day, in search of the next meal, the next safe place to sleep. The physical and mental toughness required is almost unimaginable to us today. These were people who were intimately familiar with hardship, with loss, and with the raw, untamed power of nature. But through it all, they persevered. They learned, they adapted, they innovated, they developed complex language to coordinate hunts and share knowledge. They created breathtaking art deep within caves, leaving behind ghostly handprints and vibrant paintings of the animals that sustained them, a mythos across millennia, telling us, we were here. This deep past is not just a collection of dusty facts. It's encoded in our DNA. The urge to explore, the thrill of discovery, the deep satisfaction of working together to solve a problem. These are echoes of our nomadic heritage. For tens of thousands of years, movement was life. It kept our gene pool diverse. It pushed us into every corner of the planet, from the frozen Arctic to the dense jungles of the tropics. It made us the most adaptable species the world has ever known. Then, about 12,000 years ago, something changed. In a few places around the world, our ancestors began to experiment with a new way of life. They started planting seeds, cultivating crops, and domesticating animals. They discovered that they could stay in one place and make the land provide for them. This was the agricultural revolution, and it would change the course of human history forever. The river of humanity began to slow, to pool, to form the permanent settlements that would eventually become villages, towns, and the sprawling cities we live in today. With settlement came new ideas: ownership, property, inheritance, hierarchy. Life became more predictable, but perhaps a little less free. We gained food security, but created social inequality. We built walls to protect our belongings, and in doing so, created the concept of the outsider. We traded the open road for a fixed address. It was a monumental trade-off, one that we are still grappling with today. When we feel that itch to travel, to see what's over the next hill, to leave the familiar behind and venture into the unknown, we are tapping into that ancient, nomadic spirit. It's a reminder that for the vast majority of our time on this planet, our story was not one of routes, but of roads. It was a life lived on the move, a testament to the incredible resilience, cooperation, and adaptability of our wandering ancestors. Their journey is our journey. It's the story of how we became human. The second topic is discovering agriculture. Have you ever wondered what the single most important invention in human history is? Some might say the wheel, others the printing press, or maybe even the internet. But what if I told you the answer is something far more fundamental, something that completely rewired our DNA as a species. It's the simple, yet profound, discovery of agriculture. Before about 12,000 years ago, our ancestors were nomads, constantly on the move. Their lives were a relentless cycle of hunting and gathering, following the herds and the seasons. Survival was a daily struggle, a high-stakes game of chance. But then, something clicked. An incredible realization dawned upon them. A seed dropped in the ground could sprout into a plant that could be nurtured, harvested, and eaten. It sounds so simple to us now, but this was a paradigm-shattering breakthrough. For the first time, humans didn't have to chase their food. They could create it. This seemingly small shift from hunting to harvesting was the spark that ignited a revolution. The Neolithic Revolution, it wasn't just about a new way to get dinner, it was about a new way to live. This transition from a nomadic lifestyle to a settled one is arguably the most significant turning point in our history. It laid the groundwork for everything we consider civilization. Imagine the first person who intentionally planted a seed and watched it grow. The patience, the observation, the leap of faith it must have taken. They learned that certain plants, like wheat, barley, and rice, were particularly good at being domesticated. They weren't just randomly scattering seeds. They were actively selecting the ones with the best traits, the largest grains, the toughest stalks. This was the birth of selective breeding, a process we still use today. Humans began to actively shape the natural world to suit their needs, becoming co-pilots in evolution rather than just passengers. This newfound ability to produce food created something our ancestors had never experienced before: a surplus, more food than could be eaten in a day, a week, or even a month. A surplus is more than just extra calories. It's a buffer against uncertainty. It's security, but it also came with a new set of challenges. How do you store this surplus? How do you protect it from pests, from weather, from other people? Suddenly, staying in one place made a lot of sense. You couldn't just wander off and leave your precious crops unattended. Fields needed to be cleared, tilled, and watered. They needed protection from wild animals. Harvested grains needed to be kept dry and safe in granaries. All of this required a permanent base of operations. The nomadic urge, the freedom to roam, was traded for the security of a home. For the first time in our species' history, we started to put down roots, quite literally. This shift to a sedentary lifestyle had a cascade of effects. Life became more predictable. It was no longer a frantic daily search for food, but a structured cycle based on the agricultural calendar: planting in the spring, tending in the summer, harvesting in the fall, and waiting through the winter. This predictability allowed for long-term planning. People could save food for lean times, allowing their communities to weather droughts or harsh winters that would have devastated a hunter-gatherer group. With a more stable food supply, populations began to boom. Villages sprouted up around fertile lands, growing larger and more complex. More people living together meant new social structures were needed. Think about it. When you have a handful of people, decisions can be made informally. But when you have hundreds or thousands, you need rules. You need leaders. You need ways to resolve disputes. The concept of ownership also became deeply important. If you spent months clearing a field and tending your crops, that land felt like yours. This was a radical departure from the communal, transient ownership of hunter-gatherer territories. Land became a valuable commodity, something to be inherited, defended, and sometimes fought over. The first fences weren't just to keep animals out. They were to mark what was mine and what was yours. This is the origin of private property, an idea that profoundly shapes our world today. The agricultural surplus didn't just feed more mouths, it freed up hands. Not everyone had to be a farmer anymore. When you have enough food to go around, some people can specialize in other things. Someone could become a potter, creating better vessels to store grain and water. Another could become a weaver, making stronger textiles. Others became builders, tool makers, or priests who prayed for a good harvest. This division of labor was the engine of innovation. Specialists could dedicate their entire lives to perfecting a single craft, leading to rapid advancements in technology and culture. We see the emergence of pottery, metallurgy, and more sophisticated tools. We see the construction of permanent, elaborate structures, homes, temples, and defensive walls. These weren't just functional. They were expressions of a community's identity, its beliefs, and its power. But let's be clear, the transition to agriculture wasn't all sunshine and bumper crops. For the average person, life in some ways got harder. Early farmers had a less varied diet than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, often relying on just one or two staple crops. This led to nutritional deficiencies. which we can see in the skeletal remains from this period. Skeletons from early agricultural societies often show signs of shorter stature and worse dental health compared to their forager predecessors. Farming was also backbreaking work. Clearing land, plowing fields, and harvesting crops by hand was physically demanding and relentless. And living in crowded, permanent settlements created new problems. Diseases could spread much more easily in a village than among a small, mobile band of people. Waste disposal became an issue. Proximity to domesticated animals introduced a whole new range of zoonotic diseases. Moreover, this new way of life created social hierarchy. The surplus wasn't always distributed equally. Those who controlled the land, the granaries, or the water sources could accumulate wealth and power. This led to the emergence of a ruling class: chiefs, kings, and priests, and a laboring class who worked the fields. Society became strong. Inequality, a concept largely foreign to egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands, became an enduring feature of human civilization. So, was the agricultural revolution a mistake? It's a fascinating debate among historians, and on one hand, it gave us civilization, as we know, its cities, writing, art, science, technology. It allowed our population to grow from a few million to nearly 8 billion today. Without agriculture, there would be no pyramids, no symphonies, no space exploration. On the other hand, it introduced new forms of hardship, grueling labor, disease, famine when crops failed, social inequality, and warfare over land and resources. It tied us to the land, transforming our relationship with the planet from one of coexistence to one of control and exploitation. We traded the wild freedom of the savannah for the structured security of the farm. And in doing so, we changed ourselves forever. The discovery of agriculture wasn't just about food. It was about the birth of a new human identity. It rooted us for better and for worse. It forced us to cooperate on a massive scale, to plan for the future, and to build complex societies. It was the moment we stopped being just another species shaped by our environment and started becoming a species that shapes the environment to its will. Every city you see, every book you read, every law that governs us can trace its lineage back to that first seed, intentionally planted in the earth. The echoes of that ancient revolution still define our world today. The third topic is from camps to villages. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to never have a permanent home? To constantly be on the move, following the seasons, chasing the herds. For thousands of years, this was the reality for our ancestors. They lived in small, mobile groups, setting up temporary camps wherever they could find food and water. Life was a continuous journey, a dance with nature. Their homes were simple, easily packed up, and moved tents made of animal skins, or shelters built from branches and leaves. Everything they owned had to be carried on their backs. This nomadic lifestyle was incredibly efficient for hunting and gathering, but it was also demanding and uncertain. Every day was a struggle for survival, a search for the next meal. But then, something incredible happened, a revolution that would forever change the course of human history. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, gradual shift, a quiet discovery that blossomed across the globe. Our ancestors learned to cultivate plants. They figured out that by saving seeds from the wild grasses they gathered and planting them in fertile soil, they could create a reliable, predictable food source. This was the dawn of agriculture. This single innovation was the seed from which our modern world would grow. It sounds simple, right? Plant a seed, wait for it to grow. But the implications were monumental. For the first time, humans didn't have to just take what nature offered. They could actively shape their environment to meet their needs. Imagine the sheer revelation of it all. Instead of spending every waking hour searching for food, you could create it right outside your door. This newfound control over the food supply was a game. The fields of wheat, barley, and corn weren't just providing calories. They were providing security. They were providing stability. And with that stability came a profound change in how people lived. The constant need to move began to fade. Why wander off in search of wild berries when you had a field of grain ripening just a stone's throw away? The anchor of agriculture began to hold people in one place. The temporary camps, once abandoned after a few weeks or months, started to last a little longer. A season, a year, a generation. Slowly but surely, these long-term camps started to transform. The flimsy, portable shelters that were perfect for a life on the move were no longer practical. If you're going to stay in one place, you want something a bit more substantial, a bit more permanent. People began to build houses. They used mud, stone, and wood to construct sturdy dwellings that could withstand the elements and last for years. A collection of tents became a cluster of homes. These clusters grew, and the first permanent settlements were born. We call them villages. This wasn't just a change in architecture, it was a fundamental change in the human experience. The concept of home as a fixed, lasting place was taking root for the very first time. Life in these new villages was completely different from the nomadic existence that came before. For one, the population grew. A steady food supply could support more people, and families started to get bigger. Living together in a permanent settlement also required a new level of social organization. You weren't just living with your immediate family anymore. You were part of a larger community of dozens, or even hundreds, of people. And to make that work, you needed cooperation. Think about it. Farming is a team sport. A single family might struggle to clear a large field, plant thousands of seeds, and protect the crops from pests and predators. But a whole village working together, that's a different story. People began to pool their efforts for the common good. They worked side by side in the fields, coordinating the planting and harvesting seasons. They built shared granaries to store the surplus food, creating a safety net for everyone in case of a bad harvest. They dug irrigation canals to bring water to their crops, a massive undertaking that would be impossible for an individual to complete. They built walls and fences around the village to protect their homes and their precious food stores from wild animals and rival groups. This large-scale cooperation was a new and powerful force in human society. It allowed people to accomplish things they could never have dreamed of, as scattered, nomadic bands. As communities grew and tasks became more complex, something else started to happen. Specialization in a small hunter-gatherer group. Everyone pretty much did the same things. Everyone helped find food, make tools, and build shelters. But in a village, it was more efficient for people to focus on specific jobs. Some people were naturally better at farming, so they became the primary food producers. Others were skilled with their hands, so they became the builders, constructing houses and storage facilities. Some were strong and brave, so they took on the role of guards, protecting the village from threats. We see the emergence of tool makers, potters who created containers to store grain and water, and weavers who turned plant fibers and animal wool into textiles. This division of labor made the entire community more productive and resilient. The farmer could focus on growing the best crops, knowing that the potter was making the jars to store them in, and the builder was maintaining the roof over his head. People could trade their skills and their goods with each other. The farmer might give a share of his harvest to the toolmaker in exchange for a new plow. This economic interdependence wove the community even closer together. It created a web of relationships and obligations that strengthened the social fabric of the village. Everyone had a role to play, and everyone's contribution was valuable to the survival and prosperity of the group. Of course, this new way of life wasn't without its challenges. Living in close quarters with hundreds of other people creates friction. Disputes over land, water, or resources were bound to happen. Who gets the plot of land with the most fertile soil? How is the water from the irrigation ditch shared? Who decides how the surplus grain is distributed? These were complex questions that nomadic groups rarely had to face. To solve them, villages needed leadership and rules. Decision-making could no longer be informal. It affected everyone, so a system had to be developed to manage the community's affairs. This could have been a council of elders, a respected chief, or some other form of early governance. This was the birth of social complexity. Rules were established, traditions were formed, and social hierarchies began to emerge. The very act of staying put created a whole new set of problems to solve. Waste disposal, for instance, is not a big deal when you move every few weeks, but in a permanent settlement, it becomes a major health hazard if not managed properly. Diseases could also spread more easily in a densely populated village. And what about security? A village with a large store of food was a very tempting target for outsiders. The commitment to a settled life meant you had to be prepared to defend it. Life was no longer as simple as packing up and moving on if trouble arose. You had invested too much. You had roots. This transition from nomadic camps to settled villages was arguably one of the most important turning points in human history. It laid the foundation for everything that followed. The rise of cities, the development of writing, the formation of governments, and the birth of civilization as we know it. It was a trade-off. Humanity gave up the freedom of the open road for the security of a permanent home. We exchanged the thrill of the hunt for the patient work of the harvest. This shift created new opportunities for cooperation, innovation, and cultural development. But it also introduced new challenges of conflict, disease, and social inequality. It was the moment we stopped simply living in the world and started to build our own. The legacy of these first villagers is all around us. In the towns and cities we live in today, they were the pioneers of settled life, and their story is our story. The fourth topic is land, boundaries, and control. Have you ever wondered why we have rules, borders, and governments? Why isn't everyone just free to roam and do as they please? The answer, surprisingly, goes all the way back to the moment our ancestors decided to stop wandering and settle down. It's a story about a trade-off, a deal we made thousands of years ago that shaped everything we know today. Let's rewind the clock and explore how the simple act of staying put changed humanity forever. For most of human history, we were nomads, hunter-gatherers. We followed the herds, moved with the seasons, and the idea of owning a piece of the earth would have seemed completely bizarre. The world was a shared resource. If a place ran out of food, you just moved on. There was a natural equality to this lifestyle. Everyone contributed, and survival depended on the group, not on what you owned. But then, something revolutionary happened. We learned to farm. This wasn't an overnight change. It was a slow, gradual revolution. But once we figured out how to plant seeds and wait for them to grow, everything started to shift. For the first time, a specific piece of land became incredibly valuable. This wasn't just some random spot anymore. This was our field. This was the patch of ground that would feed our families for the entire year. And once that happened, we had a problem we'd never faced before. We had to protect it. Suddenly, you couldn't just let anyone wander through your crops. You couldn't let their animals eat the sprouts you'd spent months tending. And so, the first boundaries appeared. Maybe they were just a line of stones, a simple fence, or a thorny hedge. But they were a powerful new symbol. They screamed, "This is mine, and that is yours." The concept of ownership was born from the soil. With ownership came the need for rules. Who gets the fertile land by the river? Who gets the rocky patch on the hill? What happens when someone's cattle tramples your wheat? These questions couldn't be solved by just walking away anymore. People were invested. They had put their sweat and labor into the land. So, someone had to start making decisions. Someone had to become the referee. This is where authority begins to take shape. Maybe it was the oldest, wisest person in the group, or the strongest warrior who could enforce the rules. This person, or group of elders, became the first primitive form of government, deciding who got to use which land and settling disputes. Staying in one place created a whole new set of challenges that nomadic life never had. You now had a permanent village, a home. And that home needed to be defended from outsiders who might want to take your stored food or your valuable land. Walls were built, and watchtowers were erected. A defense force became necessary. This required organization, planning, and leadership. And what about the food? A successful harvest meant a surplus. More food than you could eat right away. This food had to be stored and managed. Who was in charge of the granary? Who decided how the surplus was distributed? Especially during a bad year. The person who controlled the food held immense power. They could decide who eats and who doesn't. This control over resources was a critical step in the formation of social hierarchy. Slowly but surely, the relatively flat, egalitarian structure of hunter-gatherer societies began to crumble. In its place, a pyramid started to form. At the top were the leaders, the priests, the warriors, those who controlled the land, the food, and the rules. Below them were the farmers, the artisans, and the laborers who did the physical work. Hierarchy had replaced equality. Specialists emerged. Not everyone had to be a farmer anymore. Some could become potters, weavers, or blacksmiths. This division of labor made society more complex and, in many ways, more efficient. But it also solidified the new social structure. Your birth could now determine your station in life. Think about it. The need to protect a field of wheat led to borders. The need to settle disputes over that field led to laws and leaders. The need to defend a village and its stored grain led to armies and fortifications. All these layers of control, which we now call civilization, were built upon that initial decision to settle down. This was the price of staying. We traded the freedom of the open plains for the security of a permanent home. We gave up a certain kind of equality for the stability and abundance that agriculture could provide. It's a fascinating paradox. The very thing that allowed our populations to explode and our cultures to flourish, staying in one place also, created the systems of control and inequality that we have been grappling with ever since. From the first fence to the modern nation-state, the story is the same. A story of land, boundaries, and the struggle for control. Every law, every border, every government on earth can trace its ancestry back to that first farmer who drew a line in the dirt and said, "This is mine." It makes you look at the world around you a little differently, doesn't it? The next time you see a fence or cross a border, remember that ancient trade-off. It's a legacy written into the very landscape of our modern world. Thanks for watching. And if you found this journey back in time interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into how our world came to be. See you next time.